Since time immemorial, plants and fungi have proven to be one of Homo sapiens' greatest resources, not just as sustenance, but as a fount of healing medicine, spiritual inspiration, and mystery. Humans do not merely utilize these species for these purposes, but are intrinsically involved in the cultural knowledge surrounding them, their domestication, and safekeeping. Imagine a world without painkillers, antibiotics, anticoagulants, anti-malarial medicines, or some chemotherapies, all of which have been either directly derived from, synthesized, or inspired by plants and fungi. And who would want to live in a world without the mystery and magic of poison-tipped arrows or hallucinogens? In Plants of the Gods podcast, renowned ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin, who has worked in and on the Amazon for almost 4 decades studying the relationship between humans and plants, takes his listeners on an inspiring journey from the most remote corners of Amazonia to other exotic locales. Learn about the fascinating history and uses of the plants of knowledge and power, like the hallucinogenic snuffs of the Yanomamo tribe, to coca, from which cocaine is derived, the ayahuasca liana, from which a hallucinogenic brew is produced, or the diverse formulations of curare, a plant mixture which relaxes the muscles of the body and leads to asphyxiation. Not only will you better understand what we know about these sacred species and how we use them, but how they are revolutionizing Western medicine while the fight is on to protect these healing species and the people who know them best. This and more from Plants of the Gods with Dr. Mark Plotkin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team. I'm an ethnobotanist, a scientist who studies the uses of plants, fungi, and even animals for medicinal purposes in the rainforests of Central and South America. I've been doing this for almost 40 years. I was a student of the great Harvard ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, often called the father of ethnobotany. I dropped out of college after my freshman year and started working in a museum at Harvard, essentially as a gopher, enrolled in a night school course on the botany and chemistry of hallucinogenic plants taught by Professor Schultes himself, and I've been hooked ever since. The point of this podcast is to teach and to learn about the hallucinogenic, entheogenic, mind-altering substances used by shamans and other healers around the world, with a heavy emphasis on the rainforest, and to be able to share some of what I've learned and some of what I've seen, both answers and questions, with people who have an interest in this topic. Now, I learned from Professor Schultes that if you want to save the rainforest, you have to save the indigenous peoples of the rainforest. And if you want to save the indigenous peoples of the rainforest, you not only have to work in partnership with all of them, you particularly have to partner with the shamans themselves. This is what we call biocultural conservation. It's not about saving rainforests or saving shamans. They are intricately linked. And if you look at the best rainforest left in the Amazon, it tends to be not in national parks, but indigenous reserves. So indigenous peoples, from the view of the Amazon Conservation Team, are the glue that holds the forest intact, and the shamans are the glue that hold the indigenous cultures intact. When missionaries go in, the first person they attack and typically try to undercut is the shaman, the medicine man or medicine woman, who, as I said, is the cultural glue that holds the tribe and the tribal culture together, and it's the tribal culture that holds the rainforest in place. And we'll be talking more about that through the course of this podcast. Now, as I said, I followed in the footsteps of Professor Schultes, who was a pioneer in many aspects of Plants of the Gods, partnering with Albert Hoffman, the chemist who invented LSD, to write the classic book Plants of the Gods, which I highly recommend. Schultes was the first scientist to study ayahuasca, to take ayahuasca in situ, in place, in a tribal setting, and go through many ceremonies, many ayahuasca ceremonies with the indigenous peoples themselves. And let me read for you my favorite quote, of Schultes on ayahuasca. There's a magic intoxicant in the Northwest Amazon in which the Indians believe can free the soul from corporal confinement and allow it to wander free and return to the body at will. The soul, thus untrammeled, liberates its owner from the everyday life and introduces him or her to wondrous realms of what he considers reality and permits him or her to communicate with his ancestors. The Quechua term for this inebriating drink, ayahuasca, is the vine of the soul, and it refers to this freeing of the spirit. Now, ayahuasca and many other hallucinogens and entheogens are coming to the fore. Studies, and we'll get into this in the course of the podcast, are now indicating that the birth of many, if not most, religions are rooted in these types of magical plants or other hallucinogenic properties found in fungi and in some cases even animals. There's a new book coming out called The Immortality Key that I recommend by a fellow named Brian Rurescu, which talks about the origins of Christianity and entheogenic fungi. There are indications some of the beginnings of Judaism may be rooted in these mind-altering substances as well. But as I said, there's fodder for more discussions of this. The most significant medical development in terms of Western medicine recently has been the mainstreaming of hallucinogens into our own Western medicine. Hallucinogens are the shamanic medicine par excellence, but now they're finding their way, almost magically, almost shamanically, into very traditional halls of Western medicine. These hallucinogens in the tropical forest permit medicine men and women to investigate, diagnose, treat, and sometimes cure ailments that have a partial emotional or spiritual basis, which is why they can sometimes alleviate a medical issue unresponsive to the therapies of Western physician. In a sense, hallucinogens are vegetal or fungal scalpels which allow the shaman to find, analyze, treat, and sometimes cure emotional issues which our own physicians cannot. The recent creation of the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University, supported in part by my buddy Tim Ferriss, as well as similar efforts underway at other prominent universities like Yale and NYU, shamanic medicine is rapidly shifting from being considered unconventional, non-effective, primitive, to conventional. It is becoming part of conventional medicine. Many of the initial evaluations from the Western medical perspective have focused on mescaline, which is, of course, from Mexican peyote, we'll be talking about in a later podcast, psilocybin from magic mushrooms, and ayahuasca itself. These mind-altering remedies have been clinically shown, clinically proven to produce promising therapeutic effects in some cases of addiction, depression, and even OCD. Clinicians are equally enthused about the possibilities of experimenting with these therapies to treat ailments as diverse as anorexia, early-stage Alzheimer's, insomnia, and even PTSD, one of the most terrible afflictions of our troops. The late Stanislav Grof, a pioneer in the field of psychotherapy, I love this quote, was fond of saying that psychedelics are to psychology the same way that telescopes are to astronomy and microscopes are to the study of bacteria. This newfound interest in hallucinogenic therapies is not only improving our understanding of the human mind, it's also driving an enhanced appreciation of the effectiveness of shamanic healing. Now, my organization, the Amazon Conservation Team, was founded on many of these precepts. We believe that shamans are some of the most accomplished healers in the world. We don't believe it, we know it. And they can sometimes treat and even cure ailments which Western medicine cannot. This was taught to me, this was taught to us by the late Professor Schultes, and we were specifically set up to partner with indigenous cultures, particularly shamanic cultures, to protect indigenous culture and indigenous rainforest. And we at ACT, find more about us on the web at amazonteam.org, have been able to partner with many of the original ayahuasca tribes, like the Kamsa, which is the tribe that first taught ayahuasca to Schultes, the Sionas, the Coraguaje, the Cofans, and the Inga. And the Amazon Conservation Team works with them to this day. And the importance of this type of conservation based on these shamanic precepts has already been manifested in two concrete examples. We have partnered with our indigenous colleagues in the Northwest Amazon, as well as the Colombian government, to establish the Orito Indihuasi Floral Sanctuary with the Cofan tribe in the Colombian Amazon, as well as the establishment of the Indihuasi Protected Area with the Ngano tribe. This was perhaps the first co-managed area in the Northwest Amazon between indigenous peoples and the outside world, just like the Indihuasi Reserve was the first sanctuary set up to protect sacred plants like ayahuasca and yoko, which is a tribal stimulant. We have worked with these tribes, with our Colombian colleagues in academia and the government, to map, manage, and enhance protection of over 500 square miles of indigenous ancestral rainforest.
To purchase Dr. Mark Plotkin's new book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, or his first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, visit your local bookseller or order from Amazon.com.
So I want to talk a bit more about what is ayahuasca and its importance and increasing importance in the world today, and what it teaches us about healing, what it teaches about entheogenic plants and fungi, what it teaches us about tribal knowledge. This was a plant, this was a liana, first discovered, and of course, as Schultes said, ethnobotanists don't discover anything. We just write what our indigenous colleagues teach us. We write it down. It's now become global in its reach. From Argentina to Australia, from Israel to Istanbul, this once obscure Amazonian liana, admixed with a few other species, is now celebrated and even venerated as a plant of power, knowledge, and healing, which has already spawned two state-recognized religions in Brazil. It's first and foremost a liana called ayahuasca in the Northwest Amazon. Its scientific name is Banisteriopsis caapi, and that honors the indigenous name. In the northwest corner of Brazil, the indigenous tribes and adjacent tribes across the border into Colombia call it caapi. When a scientist works and respects indigenous culture and wisdom, she or he typically develops a scientific name based on the indigenous name to honor their knowledge, and that's why it's called Banisteriopsis caapi. The vine is also known as Yage, Y-A-G-E. It is predominantly known by this name in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and it's also known in Huasca and other parts of Brazil, where it's become a staple of these new religions. Any of these names may refer to the liana itself or to the potions which feature this liana, as well as the admixtures. Now, the origins of ayahuasca are impossible to determine because very few things fossilize in the rainforest for complex ecological reasons. However, there are abundant archaeological finds of figures, snuff trays, snuff tubes, and snuff residue that prove that hallucinogenic plant use in the Western Amazon, in Western South America, goes back at least as far as 2000 BCE. Schultes wrote, "The drink employed for prophecy, divination, sorcery, and medical purposes is so deeply rooted in native mythology there can be no doubt of its great age as part of Aboriginal life." The ethnobotanist Constantino Torres, who was an authority not only on ayahuasca but also hallucinogenic snuffs, recorded some of the first documentation of ayahuasca, which was by a Jesuit missionary named Jose Chantre y Herrera, as far back as 1675. Chantre y Herrera wrote, quote, "The diviner," that is the shaman, "hangs his hammock in the middle of the roundhouse, the maloca, and takes a bench or small platform, and next to it places a hellish brew called ayahuasca, remarkably effective in depriving of the senses. He makes a tea of the vine, after which much boiling will become very thick and bitter. It is so strong it disrupts judgment even in small quantities." Typically, this missionary's reaction to his experience is in keeping with the response of most ecclesiastic chroniclers, when they encountered mind-altering plants and fungi employed by indigenous peoples of the New World. The clergy quickly demonized and condemned these substances and mixtures, whether it was peyote in the north, magic mushrooms in Central America, or ayahuasca, yopo, and a pena hallucinogenic snuffs in Amazonia. Equally characteristic to the missionary reaction is what transpired when the very first botanists stumbled upon an ayahuasca ceremony among the Tucanoan peoples on the upper Valpes River in the northwest of Brazil near the Colombian border. This was Richard Spruce, one of the great botanists in the history of Amazonia. Spruce took a small drink of the copy mixture and did not have the same deep spiritual experience that Schultes later did, who did it many times. But after the ceremony, Spruce ventured into the forest to collect the vine and flower, which was necessary for making a precise identification. Botanists cannot take a piece of a vine and typically identify it. Indigenous peoples can take a piece of the vine and not only identify the name of the vine, they'll tell you the use of the vine, they'll tell you where it grows, they tell you what soil type it likes, it tells you when it flowers, what pollinates it, and what the seeds look like. Spruce realized that this represented a species unknown to science, and he named it Banasteri Kapi, honoring the Tucanoan name, which, as I said, was Kapi. Now, one of the great and understudied aspects of the plants of the gods, of the hallucinogenic substances, is admixtures, which are plants, typically plants, sometimes insects, added to the potion with the intention of altering the type, intensity, and duration of the experience. They represent a complex and fascinating aspects of the story. In fact, we've been able to document over 100 different plants from 40 different families added to the ayahuasca brew. Most of these, as I said, are flowering plants, although one is a gymnosperm, a conifer essentially, and another is a fern. There's also records of snake fangs, snake poison, frogs being added. It is a rich field for further research. The two most important admixtures to ayahuasca are either the shrub chacruna, which is a vine of the coffee family, Psychotria viridis, or the liana Okoyahe Diplopterus cabrerana of the Malpighiaceae, which is actually the same family as ayahuasca itself. What's interesting about these two is that chacruna is found throughout the Amazon, whereas Okoyahe is not. So one of these admixtures is really found predominantly in the northwest Amazon, the other is found throughout Amazonia. As I said, ayahuasca itself traditionally is native to certainly the northwest Amazon and quite possibly the western Amazon. I spoke to Bronwyn Gates, the botanical expert on the Malpighiaceae family, who herself worked with Schultes, and she said at this point we're still not sure of the original distribution of the ayahuasca liana, and now that it's being grown throughout the world, it makes it even more difficult. Now, what's intriguing about these admixtures is that they contain hallucinogenic tryptamines, which is another type of alkaloid, a chemical substance common in many plants. Caffeine is an alkaloid, strychnine is an alkaloid. Now, these tryptamines prove inert when consumed orally unless they are activated by the presence of compounds which are known as monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAO inhibitors. Ayahuasca contains psychotropic alkaloids of this type, meaning the combination of these plants produce strikingly more potent and profound effects than a potion prepared from either species. How shamans living in a rainforest comprising 40,000 species of plants discovered the appropriate blend to induce otherworldly visions and insights remains a shamanic riddle. Imagine being in a rainforest of tens of thousands of plant species and figuring out which two go best together. This is an incredibly impressive shamanic achievement, medical achievement, however you want to look at it. Scientists simply cannot come up with an adequate explanation through the prism of Western science and knowledge. In the Amazon, the brew is typically prepared by boiling the stem of the ayahuasca vine with the admixtures for several hours, producing a thick and highly bitter concoction, which is then consumed in small doses. Approximately 20 minutes after the initial dose, the subject usually experiences the onset of dizziness and nausea, often preceding a purge, either vomiting or defecation, which the shamans insist is part of the process, that you must clean your body of toxic substances. And shamans insist that many of the ills that afflict Western society are because we do not expel toxic substances like they do, using a variety of plants, often ayahuasca, but not only ayahuasca, and there's many shamanic cultures that don't use ayahuasca, purge themselves intentionally to cleanse themselves of toxins that the body accumulates over time. Within the next hour, visions commence, often inducing fear, stress, and even terror, and frequently followed by scenes of unsurpassed loveliness and spiritual illumination. Participants in traditional ayahuasca sessions sometimes report the ability to communicate telepathically with the shamans guiding the ceremony, so much so that the first alkaloid isolated from ayahuasca vine was named telepathine. Now, Schultes often said that the difference between an ethnobotanist and an anthropologist is when the shaman leans forward and she or he offers you the brew containing ayahuasca or the snuff tubes containing yopo, the hallucinogenic snuff, or the magic mushrooms, that the anthropologist typically says, oh no, I can't do that. I would lose my objectivity. How would I take notes? Whereas when the shaman passes it to the ethnobotanist, she or he looks at the shaman and says, yeehaw. If you want to truly begin to understand shamanic cultures and shamanic healing and the plants of the gods and the fungi of the gods and the magic frogs of the gods, you need to experience the ceremony as the shaman, as the indigenous people see it. Now, as an ethnobotanist, I've been through probably 80 or 90 ayahuasca ceremonies, always in a ritual context, always led by a shaman, because these are plants of power and knowledge and danger as well. These are not plants or compounds to be trifled with. And let me tell you about my worst ayahuasca experience of all. I was in the middle of a ceremony with a Kamsa shaman, actually an Engano shaman from Colombia, and I soon was able to realize that this was going to be a very, very, very bad trip. And I then found myself vomiting purple phosphorescent scorpions. So anyone who thinks that this is going to be a fun ride, anyone who thinks this is always going to be a world of wonder and magic and lots of fun, is underestimating what these types of journeys can consist of, and which is all the more reason why you need a guide. And when I finished with the most terrible night of my life, going through this terrible, terrible ceremony, I asked the shaman, who was a friend and teacher, why he had subjected me to this. And he said, as a conservationist, as a friend of the indigenous peoples, you confront many challenges. He said, by experiencing your death in a ritual fashion, you will never fear death and travail ever again. I have prepared you for the path of the warrior. And these are the depths of the emotions and the challenges, mental and spiritual, which all of us who have an interest in trying, taking, consuming the plants of the gods must be ready to face. So let me conclude this podcast with perhaps the most germane comment in terms of the history and the power of ayahuasca in particular and the plants of the gods in general. Amazonian shamans imbibe ayahuasca to diagnose, treat, and cure illnesses, and claim that the potion empowers them to see into the future, ward off misfortune, and provide protection against jealousy and negativity. In the words of Professor Schultes, ayahuasca can free the soul from confinement, allow it to wander free, and return to the body at will. Ayahuasca, the vine of the soul, refers to this freeing of the spirit. The plants involved are truly the plants of the gods.
This has been Plants of the Gods, Healing, Culture, and Conservation with Dr. Mark Plotkin. Stay tuned for more stories about shamans, hallucinogens, entheogens, unique religious and cultural histories, and rainforest adventures and cures. If you enjoyed this episode, please recommend us to your friends and rate and review on iTunes. To learn more about the mystery and splendor of the Amazon rainforest, find Dr. Plotkin's latest book, The Amazon: What Everyone Needs to Know, on Amazon.com or your local bookstore. To learn more about the Amazon Conservation Team's efforts to protect these plants of power and wisdom, visit amazonteam.org. Thanks for listening to Plants of the Gods with Dr. Mark Plotkin.